Good evening, Beverley. Well, indeed, Lviv, you've mentioned it, is very far from the front line. It's 1,000 kilometers away from the front line. It is very close to the European Union. It's 120 kilometers away from the Polish border. And of course, nowhere is really safe in Ukraine, but the western part of the country has been relatively spared the deadly attacks, missile strikes that we've been seeing day in, day out over the rest of the country. And this is the biggest attack, the largest attack that Lviv people have suffered since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion. And it's all the more tragic that there's thousands of internally displaced Ukrainians who came from the eastern part of the country to seek refuge in the western part of the country. So it's a tragedy, yet another tragedy here in Ukraine.
And it feels, as you might indicate, almost targeted for that reason. And is it targeted too because it is close to the European Union, close to the Polish border?
Well, of course, we can imagine that this is yet another provocation by the Kremlin, to say that, yes, we are capable of striking there. But I think it's more, in the spirit of just terrorizing the population, which has been done over and over. Just to give you an idea, there's another region in the northern central part of Ukraine called the Sumy Oblast. It has been shelled 276 times yesterday only. I don't know if you can imagine the amount of terror that those people can encounter. And here in Lviv, this attack happened in the very early hours of the day when people are asleep, when people don't necessarily hear the air raid alerts around the city. And if you're an elderly person, perhaps also you cannot move to safety. And one of the victims, the eldest actually, was 95. It was a woman who survived World War II just to meet this horrible death.
Yeah, that is just a tragedy. There's a lot of focus on Zaporizhzhia and the nuclear plant there. The Ukrainians have indicated that they believe Russia could be planning some form of attack. But Russia, of course, says the same about Ukraine. How do we understand what the risks are there at the moment?
Well, the risks are very high, but on the accusations on both sides, we have to keep in mind that Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant has been occupied since last year by Russia. So if there's one country that has access to that power plant, this is not Ukraine at the moment, it is Russia. And satellite imagery as well as Ukrainian intelligence show that there's seemingly devices look like they could be explosives that have been placed on the rooftops of 2 out of the 4 reactors number 3, reactors number 4. It doesn't mean that Ukraine is saying that there's going to be an explosion by Russia provoked within the reactor, which would lead to a tragedy, which would lead to a nuclear cataclysm. But what Ukraine believes is that Russia is trying to stage an incident around this reactor to then blame Ukraine for it. But we have to take a step back and just think that Ukraine has no interest, it has nothing to gain and everything to lose in damaging its own power plant.
Yeah. The IAEA says it is satisfied at this point but wants to do further checks. Will they get the access they need?
That's what they are requesting, because so far they didn't have access to those rooftops I've just mentioned. So from what they saw, they couldn't see any explosive devices, but Ukraine intelligence locates those to the rooftops. So that's the access that external observers and international observers have requested. But there's one hint of good news today with Kirill Budanov, who's the head of the Ukrainian intelligence, who gave an interview colleagues of the Times today, and he said that the threat that has been really high for weeks now seems to be receding following actions of the Ukrainian army. Of course, we don't have much more details, but if the head of the intelligence is saying that, let's hold on to that for the moment.
Yeah, that is good news, and we look for that every day. On more sombre news, you attended the funeral of the writer and war crimes researcher Victoria Amelina. She was killed in the attack on that pizza restaurant in Kramatorsk. Give us a sense of what that was like.
Well, it was very moving. It's unfortunately not the first funeral that I've attended because funerals of young, bright Ukrainians that shouldn't have died, at that moment, they happen every day, especially here in Kyiv. You have all the intelligentsia that had been fighting, with words, not only with weapons, but also with words against this invasion. Well, they are also a target. And Victoria Melina was a fiction writer, then she moved on to document Russian war crimes. She unearthed the diary of a children's author in Izium region who was murdered by Russia as well. She was a very, very known and a very beloved figure here. So this was yet another strike on Ukrainian culture. And Victoria herself said that she was part of the new executed Renaissance. So executed Renaissance, you might not be familiar with that term, but it defines all the Ukrainian writers, poets, intellectuals of the 1920s and 1930s that had been starved to death, jailed, tortured, murdered by the Soviet regime. And there's very much the spirit at the moment here in Ukraine that, the intellectuals there are equally persecuted and equally the target of the Russian regime. So Victoria Melina's death, yet another tragic blow to Ukrainian society.
Yeah, indeed. Appreciate your time, Emmanuelle, as always. Thanks so much.